صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على Muhammad. My respected elders, my respected brothers and sisters, my co-speakers and scholars, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. For the longest times, our community centers had been built in a specific way. And quite rightfully so. Our parents had been immigrants to this country. The general aura of America had been one that was absent from any Islamic communities or engagement. And so at one point, it was extremely important for our communities and those early communities to build centers that nurtured Islamic thought, centers that nurtured spirituality, and centers that really nurtured a specific idea so the new generations that were coming into America would understand what it meant to be a Muslim. Of course, that Islamic identity can't be lost. The question that I'd like to pose today is something related to this. In this new age, which I'd like to call, which is the age of ideas, and as we know, ideas are the currency of the 21st century. And after our parents and our elders and those early communities had established the centers that we needed to establish, and after they had situated themselves with their centers, and after they had situated themselves with their programs and discussions that were happening, what is the next stage for Muslim communities? And how do we understand thoughts, ideas in this new age of ideas, as we're saying? And so I'd kind of like to take the discussion in a specific direction. As you know, for the longest times, youth would enter the masjid or the mosque, and they would hear a presentation about a specific idea, and they would leave only to go back to their universities, to their households, and to their friends. And as time continues and things advance, ideas are becoming much more complex. I might go to university and hear the discussions on David Hume, or I might go to university and hear the debate, the philosophical debates, or the political debates of someone like Ayn Rand, and think to myself, that's interesting, I've never really heard this before. What also seems to happen is a young person might hear one perspective at the masjid, and then go back to school or go out to the larger world and hear 10 or 15 different opposing ideas that don't really sit well with the first idea that they had heard. And in these days, and in this world of ideas, a person can feel really dazed from all of these different discussions. And so the question really comes about is, how do we understand the platforms, or are there platforms that we can use within our centers to address the more modern debates that exist religiously, Islamically, and politically? And if they don't exist, how do young people ensure that these platforms exist in their centers? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why am I speaking about this topic to a crowd of young people versus to a crowd of executive committee members who've been controlling the mosque perhaps for the longest time? And I'll tell you why. Interestingly enough, when I first started my lecturing circuit, I was about 16 or 17, and I would first get phone calls from executive committee members asking me, hey, can you please come and lecture, whether it's for Ramadan or Muharram? And I would gladly take the opportunity. There was nothing more that I loved as a 16-year-old than to hear my own voice talk to a crowd of people. And interestingly enough, as time went on, as the older I became, the more I realized that I was getting phone calls, not from executive members in the centers, but it was more of young people who are now leading the alim committees or the tabligh committees in many of these centers. I wasn't talking to executive committee members about the topics that I was discussing. Not at all. I was actually talking to young members from the communities with their wants, their needs, the topics they need to hear, and how I'm going to be catering to that specific crowd. Now, that was interesting to me for many reasons, because it highlighted that there is a group of young people, and I see this incidentally wherever I go, who have specific questions, concerns, and ideas, and I need to note that sometimes these ideas are very different and controversial, that need to be discussed and spoken about in a safe manner where their opinions are heard. Now, to many people, this is a very touchy topic, because how are you going to bring into a specific culture or tradition, which for the longest period had talked about very, very similar themes of topics, to now have a complete 180 change to address new modern topics that are now appearing? Whether the discussion is surrounding feminism, sexuality, political philosophy, or any of the above mentioned topics, you now are really creating a dynamic shift and a change. And in the next 10 minutes, I'd like to do two things. The first thing I'd like to do is I want to remind us of the rich tradition of debate and discussion that Islam has very briefly, and then shift over to our current situation and how can we use examples of our holy Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, how can we use examples from the life of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq to really find a model which would promote discussion, debate, and the process of finding and discussing new topics within our centers? In my opinion, we live in a very interesting time, and it's a time, as I mentioned earlier, where ideas are being thrown around everywhere. Whether it's the Islamic reform movement, whether it's the movement of political ideology that's extreme, or whether it's the anti-war movement, or whether it's the Islamophobia movement, whichever movement that seems to be there, seem to be marked by a specific conversation. Arguments are part of the whole discussion, and they come to be part of the whole bundle. And in my opinion, one of the Imams whose time was very, very similar to this is no other than Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, where he lived in a time where from every single direction he was being bombarded with ideas that were completely foreign to the Muslim community. Imagine sitting in the academy of Ja'far al-Sadiq and hearing the name Aristotle or Plato for the first time. Mind you, these texts hadn't even been translated yet, and many of the early Muslims were now being introduced to things that they'd never heard about. Imagine Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq standing in front of them and using very complex arguments, whether they're arguments of philosophy and logic or political arguments, to try to persuade Muslims of one specific worldview. Now, it wasn't easy for an Imam whose people were used to one idea to now get them to broaden their scope and to think about things in a very different way. People like Ibn Abi al-Awja, who was an ardent atheist, had no issue meeting with the followers of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in the masjid to try to discuss these new ideas that were coming about within the Muslim world. Mind you, we typically think of these different debates and discussions and arguments as away from the masjid, as happening in a very academic setting, in a setting that's got nothing to do with religion. But the Imams showed us something very different. If you've looked at the life of Imam al-Sadiq, you'll very much know that his classes, which were attended by thousands, would be held within the masjid, within the academy, where the Imam would disseminate his knowledge, give his ideas, and use the mosque as an area of debate, discussion, and an area to provoke thought and understanding. The mosque, in a way, in the time of the Imam, was not seen as a safe space which would only speak about one topic or which only disseminate knowledge about one specific issue, but it would raise discussion, it would raise debate, and it would nurture debate in a very safe way for those who were around. If you look at the early debates of Imam al-Sadiq, they're profoundly filled with argumentation back and forth with those who agree with him and those who completely disagree with him. Fast forward to today, and fast forward to where we are at the moment. And the question that I pose to everyone today is, where are our mosques? And where are we from that Islamic tradition which promoted discussion within the masjid, which promoted argumentation, healthy argumentation about different topics, and which allowed people to bring about different ideas that they might have been questioning or wondering? When I visit many mosques and many centers, it's a very, very normal thing for young people to approach me and bombard me and say, "Brother, I've heard one or two of your lectures and I've got so many different questions." Now, whether they were allowed to ask these questions or not is a whole nother topic of discussion. But the important part is there are many, many different questions that are coming up. And a lot of the time, the attitude is, there's one person sitting on the minbar who's talking to me and I'm hearing them. I have a question, they have an answer, I listen to their answer, I walk out of the mosque, and that's the answer I've been given. The attitude seems to be in many ways is, spoon feed me the answer. Give me the answer. It's black and white. Is political Islam true or not? It's black and white. Does Islam need reform? What is the Islamic reform movement? Black or white? How do I prove God's existence? Black and white. Is the hijab mandatory? Black and white. But in real life, things are very different. They're much more complex. Arguments at full length are written about many of these simple topics which we might see. And the real question then is there a way to nurture discussion and conversation within our centers in a new age of ideas where young people are asking about literally everything? Whether it's sexuality, whether it's hijab, whether it's Islam, whether it's politics or philosophy, young people are asking questions about everything. And the masjid now is turning from a hub which only used to tackle one topics to a hub that has to adapt, where young people can now ask questions that before they would not get to ask. Now this does a couple of things that are extremely important. The first thing that it does is it promotes debates and discussions so that when a young person goes out to the real world, they're not shocked by the arguments and discussions that they see. Living in Dearborn, it's always interesting to see my fellow Muslims who attend the masjid with me when I'm sitting in a philosophy or a politics class. And if somebody's not a philosophy major or a political science major, at times they can get very lost in the religious and the philosophical debates because it might not be the specific field that they went into. And you can very easily pick out those individuals who've only heard a lecture about philosophy, for example, versus those who've actually discussed the topic, engaged the topic, heard the arguments of those who are against them, and heard the arguments of those who are for them. And so ultimately you can see those individuals because you know very well that to encompass the ideas that are out there today, you need to at least have an understanding of both sides of the argument. So my hypothetical is very clear. And what I'm trying to get is very simple. You are a young person and you attend a center which unfortunately is ultra safe space bound. Anything that has to be said or can be said has to be to a specific standard or criteria, or else you can't say it because it's either too controversial or maybe what you're trying to say is something that's never been said in the mosque. But you have a very different opinion, and your opinion matters. As a youth leader, or in another case, if you don't have a youth group, how do you make your voice heard? And how do you make your opposing opinion stand out and say, hey, this is my opinion, what do you think? Or can we at least have discussions about this topic? Now I'll leave you with a very interesting story to kind of stimulate the crowd and then we can get into the discussion. I remember when I was 17 years old, and I still remember this, it was one of my first or second speaking circuits, and a very controversial topic came up, which is the stories relating to the life of Imam Hussein. Now, this is, in my opinion, something that's been discussed over and over again. And I remember I was sitting in a crowd of young people, and there was another scholar and a panelist sitting next to me, and somebody gets up from the crowd and says, I've got a, burning question, and that is, how much of the stories on the life of Imam Hussein can we really trust? It was a very historical question. It wasn't a question that was very theoretical, or wasn't a question that was very practical, but just historical. And the response that I gave as a 16-year-old or 17-year-old was, you know what? There are those individuals who would, bring in stories which might not be true. I've heard people saying Al-Abbas killed 50,000 people, or, exaggerations that exist. And this isn't something that's new. This is something that's been said for the longest time ever. Interestingly enough, the scholar who is next to me gets up and says, I completely disagree, and I'm going to disagree on the basis of a dream. My grandfather saw a dream, and somebody disagreed with a historical analysis, and in the dream, the person was kind of blown to smithereens, and therefore you should never question anything about the history of this specific topic. And as a 16-year-old, I sat, and I said nothing, of course, and the crowd said nothing as well. And I remember after the event finished, a couple of young people came up to me and said, I've got a very interesting question for you. Can we use dreams as evidence for historical analysis? Does that actually happen? Are dreams a possible historical analysis for a question? And my response, and the response of other scholars, was no. Now, the reason I mention this story is because these burning questions come up a lot. Now, they don't only pertain to this specific topic, they pertain to philosophical thought, to political thought, to so many different ideas. I know a lot of young sisters approach me about the hijab. What's the discussion on feminism? How do we deal with that? What's the discussion on Islamophobia? What's the discussion on Islamic reform? And my point is very clear, and actually my question is very clear to everybody who's sitting here, and I hope we can discuss this, is there a platform in our centers currently, or perhaps in the future, where when the discussions do become very controversial and do become very different, is there a platform to engage those discussions? And is it a possibility that if we don't have that, can we maybe create that? Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.